Hello, I'm Jude Kelly. I'm going to be your MC tonight. And believe it or not, there's another whole room of you gathering underneath this room. And maybe in a room under that and a room under that, who knows? Reality being what it is, it could go on forever. But that's why I'm standing exactly here, not up there, because there's a streaming. And that's just one example of how popular Joanna is, that people are queuing to get in, to say goodbye to her, because they love her so much. And when I came tonight, I thought, well, the first thing I need to do is concentrate on my shoes. I'll just show you them. Right? Because if there's one thing one feels competitive with Joanna about, apart from her, exactly, and she hasn't let us down. There's going to be something for every fetishist afterwards. And that's a speciality of hers anyway, so as you know. Who am I? So I'm Jude Kelly. I'm the founder of the Wow Women of the World festivals, and Joanna and I first met because of that. Festivals happening all over the world, celebrating everything to do with gender equity and how do we ever get there. And as part of that, of course, Joanna's made enormous contributions in the field of history, in the field of anthropology, in the field of bloody-mindedness. I mean, she really has been exceptional in her preparedness to go to some very, very difficult places and analyse them, scrutinise them, and forensically analyse them in all kinds of ways. And we're so grateful to her for that. And when I first met her, I expected somebody who would be undoubtedly incredibly impressive, but maybe a little bit humorless, because after all, the subjects she's dealing with are tough stuff, but absolutely not. I guess you all do know her, but if you don't, do not be afraid to crack jokes. She's an excellent raconteur, and she's also an iconoclast in every single way, even about herself. Sometimes people have said to me, you know, she's fearless. I think that's an inappropriate word. I think she has plenty of fear, but what she's got is courage. And she meets every possibility with a, how can this be done? And it should be done, and if it should be done, I'll do it or I'll find somebody else. People will be here tonight because of her incredibly impressive intellectual output, but you'll also be here because of her kindness, her love of mentoring other people, young and old, to help everybody feel they can realize their potential. I think part of the reason that she does what she does is because she feels that any obstacle to human progress, psychological, structural, whatever, political, is an obstacle to somebody's flowering. And she wants people to flower. And that's part of the way she addresses all of the excitement and enthusiasm she brings to everything. So tonight's a celebration of her in every single possible way. As a human being, a brain, but also a heart and a soul. And so to kick off the celebrations, we're going to have an introduction and then a set of interviews. The very eminent historian Richard J. Evans is going to kick this off. And I've never met him before, but talking about being endearing, I just said to him, well, obviously you have this incredible history, particularly in the history of modern Germany. And also I know that, you know, you're an expert on Eric Hobsbawm, who presumably was a great friend. And he said, oh, no, no, no. He said, I was much too in awe of him to ever call him a friend. And I thought, you know, you are Richard J. Evans, but never mind, you be in awe of somebody else, that is very good in terms of humility. So he's just so lovely, and I want you to welcome him to then welcome everybody else. Richard J. Evans, thank you.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? I suppose I should explain the J, the American style, because when I was a grad student at Oxford, at St Anthony's College, I started getting these rather large wine bills, and I hadn't drunk any of it at all, so I checked up, and it was in fact Robert J. Evans, my namesake, who also worked on Central Europe and its history, and so I decided to have a slightly different way of calling myself, Richard J., which is, the confusion has lasted all our lives, and particularly when he was Regis Professor of History in Oxford and I was Regis Professor of History in Cambridge. But there we are. So it's very nice to meet you. It's wonderful to be here, and a very warm welcome to this very special event to mark the occasion of Joanna's retirement as a Gresham Professor of Rhetoric, and here the premises, this wonderful 14th century building, and Professor of History at Birkbeck. I was Professor of History at Birkbeck when we appointed Joanna to a lectureship, and Provost of Gresham College when she became Professor of Rhetoric. And incidentally, rhetoric now has been used for some time at this college to denote the humanities in general. So it tends to alternate between different parts of the humanities. And I followed Joanna's stellar career with interest and admiration over the years, and I've been asked to chair this session and privileged and delighted to do it. I've also been retired for the best part of a decade now, so I can talk with the benefit of experience about retirement and what it means. I've had younger colleagues in Cambridge asking me questions like, what do you do with your time now you're retired, and how are you enjoying your leisure? But of course these questions reflect a failure to recognize what retirement means in the 21st century, especially what it means for academics. What it means, I think, is a kind of shake-up of one's academic activities, not a sudden end to them. Out go teaching, graduate supervision, committees, administration and management, filling in tedious and irritating report forms and so on. Deleting them from one's portfolio doesn't usually lead to much regret. But what it does lead to is more space for writing, research and publication, and activities of many kinds beyond the boundaries of the university. There's still opportunities for visiting professorships, especially in the USA, also in Joanna's case, of course, in Australia, guest lectures to be given if one wants, media work, school visits, and much more besides. You can choose, it's not an obligation. Superficially, an occasion like this can all too easily turn into a kind of wake, but we all know that Joanna's not going to stop being an historian anytime soon. Still, I think her retirement does provide a good opportunity to celebrate her achievements up to now. I've only got time to mention a few. She's virtually unique among leading and indeed not so leading historians and academics in the fact she didn't go to school. Yeah, you heard me right. As the child of Pentecostalist missionaries, she grew up in far-flung parts of the world where educational facilities were not the best, including Zambia, Haiti, and the Solomon Islands, and studied mainly by taking correspondence courses. Those are the days, of course, before the coming of the internet made online learning possible. She's a New Zealander by birth, now also a British citizen, and graduated at the University of Auckland in New Zealand before moving to Canberra to take a PhD under the supervision of the Irish historian Oliver MacDonagh. Her dissertation focused on the social history of women in Ireland, making sophisticated use of quantifying methods, but her interest moved on to the cultural history of war, where she was strongly influenced, I think I'm right in saying, by the work of George L. Mosser and Jay Winter, who mentored her when she moved to Cambridge as a junior research fellow at Emmanuel College. Since the early 90s, she's expanded her coverage to include many other aspects of violence, especially sexual violence, which we'll be discussing later on. It's here that she made, I think, her most important and original contributions and carved out an international reputation. Joanna's focus has always been on the modern and contemporary history of the Anglosphere. I've tried many times to persuade her to learn a foreign language, but completely without success, I'm afraid. And particularly, of course, in 20th century Britain. Her books have illuminated the irrational side of human behavior, of medical and psychological attempts to deal with it. She's a pioneer in the history of the emotions, of love, but perhaps more particularly hate, but also fear and pain. Her works won her the Frankel Prize in Contemporary History and the Wolfson History Prize. Her books have been translated into a number of foreign languages, including Turkish and Chinese. She's forged a close relationship with the Wellcome Foundation. She's won several major grants, as well as carrying out a commission from the foundation to investigate and report on its support for the history of medicine. Henry Wellcome demanded that a part of his fortune should be used to support the history of medicine, although between ourselves, the scientists and the medics have tried frequently to overturn that. They've completely failed. The launch of her Wellcome project on sexual harms and medical encounters is a major event held in the presence of Queen Camilla, Carrie Johnson, and many other figures in British public life, if I dare mention them. One of this multidisciplinary project's primary aims is to influence policymakers across the world on how to deal with the scourge of sexual violence and its scale and ambition are promising. And all this suggests she's carved out a unique and influential presence for herself, not just on the academic scene, but more generally among the general public. Eyewitness, the 40-CD history series on 20th century British history, which she wrote for the BBC, won 3 major awards. Some time ago, the then new master of Birkbeck, Tim O'Shea, seeking to raise the college's profile, offered a bottle of wine to any member of academic staff who appeared on radio or TV. Joanna carried out from his office several crates of wine, much to his dismay. She once told me she'd been consultant for an episode in a TV series called The Adventures of the Young Indiana Jones, set in Ireland at the time of the Easter Rising. Checking through it for historical accuracy, she found many errors, including, for example, a poster in the background that wasn't made until after 1916. The TV company said, "Oh, thank you very much. Sorry, it's too late to change anything." "Well then," she said, "please remove my name from the credits." "Too late to do that too," she was told. "But don't worry," the producers said. "The credits roll up the screen so fast nobody will notice." A few months ago, Ben Franklin, New South Wales Arts Minister, demanded that Joanna's talk on her book on zoophilia, due to be delivered at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas in Sydney, because he said the festival, I quote, "cannot be seen to even implicitly condone extreme acts that have been deemed by both society and the law to be utterly unacceptable." Inevitably, of course, the story was picked up by Daily Mail Australia, which cited one citizen who told the organiser, "This is the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. An absolute disgrace that you're platforming this horror." For his part, the organiser replied that talking about a topic, however taboo it might be, was not the same as endorsing it, and asked pointedly, if somebody were to provide a history of cannibalism, does this mean they're therefore encouraging us to eat each other? In the end, the talk went ahead without incident. "I never thought it ever in my entire life I'd have to say the words, 'I'm not a bestialist,'" said Joanna when questioned by a newspaper. "I've written on killing," she added. "I've written on dismembering men. I've written on cannibalism. No one's ever accused me of being pro any of these things." That's a great relief for me, of course, as I've written extensively about Nazism. The nearest I came to being running into trouble over that was when a postgraduate student going back to Canada shipped over a case of all her notes and books and papers on Nazism, and it was impounded by Canadian customs and immigration, and I had to pull several strings to get it released. Perhaps less dramatically, Joanna's works often aroused the ire of conservative historians like Andrew, now Lord Roberts, author of laudatory biographies of Wellington and Napoleon, who called her book on World War II fatally flawed, and said, "It's sad that this book is being considered for widespread distribution in schools." Reviewing another of Joanna's books on war, the military historian Nigel Jones found her pacifism ultimately absurd. Joanna sailed close to the edge many times, tackling controversial and difficult topics like rape and sexual violence that serious historians have often avoided. At the same time, her courage in going where other historians have feared to tread has won her many admirers, sometimes in unexpected places. It was, I can say, a major factor in her election as a Fellow of the British Academy. Her colleagues' confidence in her was underlined by her election as chair of the Modern History section for a 3-year term not long ago. All of this reflects, I think, the very high quality of her scholarship, the thoroughness of her research, and the stylishness of her writing, seen nowhere better than in her recent history of Birkbeck, as we'll hear. I'm sure Joanna will produce many more major works of scholarship over the coming years, often on difficult subjects which she masters thoroughly and impressively. But on the present occasion, we want to focus on her already substantial achievements in historical scholarship. These are too broad in scope for any one person to deal with. So we're moving on now to a series of brief appraisals by leading historians, 2 leading historians and 1 eminent philosopher. I'll introduce them in turn. So, first of all, we'll hear from Pat Thane. Pat studied at Oxford and researched for her doctorate at the London School of Economics under the supervision of the leading British social scientist and reformer Brian Abel Smith. After teaching at Goldsmiths, she moved in 1994 to Sussex, where she was Professor of Contemporary History in the School of Social Sciences until 2001, and then from then till 2010, she was Leverhulme Professor of Contemporary British History at the Institute of Historical Research. She was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 2006 and is now Professor Emerita of Contemporary History in King's College, London. She's also played an active part in shaping welfare policy as Chief Scientific Advisor to the Department of Work and Pensions. And her books include The Foundations of the Welfare State, first published in 1982, Old Age in English History, which appeared in 2000, Divided Kingdom, A History of Britain, 1900 to the Present, published in 2018, and too many collaborative and edited volumes to list. She's going to talk about Joanna's work in the fields of British working class history, and especially the history of Birkbeck. Then we'll move on to Julie Marie Strange, who, or JM, I think she likes to be known, studied at the University of Wales in Cardiff, got a PhD at Liverpool and taught at Birkbeck for a couple of years before moving on to Manchester. 2019, she was appointed Professor of Modern British History at Durham, where she's currently on a 3-year Leverhulme Fellowship, researching emotion and the making of the British working class from 1848 to 1914. Her books include Death, Grief and Poverty, 1870-1914, published in 2005, Fatherhood and the British Working Class, 1865 to 1914, which appeared in 2015, and co-authored volumes including particularly, I think, The Invention of the Modern Dog, which appeared with Johns Hopkins University Press in 2015. Finally, we have Robin May Schott, who is a philosopher who's currently senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies. She works on conflict, violence, war, and gender. She's co-directed a research project on the new psychology of war, which explored the emergence of concepts of resilience and moral injury in the United States military. Her books include Cognition and Eros, 1993, Discovering Feminist Philosophy, 2003, Feminist Philosophy and the Problem of Evil, 2007, Birth, Death and Femininity, which she edited in 2010, and Resilience, Militaries and Militarization, which she co-edited with Joanna in 2022. And she's going to take a focus on wartime violence and sexual violence. So now over to Pat Thane.
Right. I've been asked to discuss Joanna's work on Birkbeck and on British working class culture, as Richard's just told you, and to discuss all of this in just 10 minutes. This, of course, represents just a fraction of a vast body of excellent published work. She's published 15 books and at least 120 published articles on an impressive range of topics, which is a record few academics can equal. And it's hard to do justice even to a small portion of all this work in the time available, but I'll do my best. These different but overlapping topics on Birkbeck and working class culture mark the beginning and the very recent output of her publishing career. The book Working Class Cultures in Britain, 1890 to 1960, Gender, Class and Ethnicity, was her second book, published in 1994, sorry, hasn't been going that long. History of Birkbeck is her most recent publication, unless she's published something else since, which wouldn't totally surprise me. It's published to commemorate Birkbeck's bicentenary this year. Working Class Cultures was impressive and distinctive when it came out, because at that time it was conventional to describe the development and maintenance of working class consciousness as something shaped by trade unions, working men's clubs, political institutions, highly political, overwhelmingly male, with minimal or no attention to gender or ethnicity or the wider culture. Joanna described and analysed consciousness of class as shaped rather by the lives, experiences and desires of individuals, female and male, of Irish, Jewish, later Commonwealth, as well as white British origin. And these were carefully reconstructed over the time period 1890 to 1960, exploring themes that were unusual in studies of working class people at the time, and actually difficult to research given the paucity of sources. The first chapter, on the body, explores what could be discovered of experiences of love or the absence of it and sex, and class differences in experiences and knowledge, which of course foreshadows some of her later work on bodies, though there's no discussion in the books I could find of negative experiences of sexual violence. In this work, Joanna can be seen as a very early proponent of what much later was described as the history of the emotions. She also stresses more visible ways in which bodies shaped perceptions and awareness of class difference, the visible differences in height, fitness, clothing of different social classes over a long period. She then goes on to study how gender-divided activities in the home, gender and race-divided experiences at work, in education, the marketplace, and the community, contributed to shaping class identity as a social and cultural rather than just an institutional and political phenomenon. What people could achieve in all these settings and how they were treated shaped their sense of their place in the culture and shaped other people's perceptions of them. So I've only time for a very superficial summary of this work, but I hope it's conveyed something of the importance and originality of her work on working class culture, and work that went on to influence the work of other historians. The recent book, The History of Birkbeck, makes a quite different contribution to understanding working class culture. It surveys an institution that was established in 1823 by radical middle-class men to make working class people, initially men, more politically aware and to improve their opportunities and quality of life through education, seeking to shape class experiences and consciousness. And Birkbeck's quite exceptional among universities in having been established for this reason and not to educate upper-class men, as most universities were. Though it wasn't founded as a university and only officially became one almost a century later when it became part of the University of London in 1920. It was then the only university for working class students studying part-time. But very soon after its foundation in 1823, it also became exceptional in recruiting women, helping them to improve their employment prospects, including as teachers. And from the 1840s, women even gave lectures, which again was extremely uncommon in institutions of that sort. They gave lectures including on women's rights and the importance of education for attaining them. Though the teaching by men and women, to men and women, wasn't exclusively political, but included art, music, drama. In the 1900s, support for women's suffrage was strong at Birkbeck, and in the 20th century, Birkbeck was very early to encourage women scientists. It was also exceptional in welcoming students of all ethnicities. Marcus Garvey, the pioneering campaigner for black equality, was a student there from 1912 to 1914. And that hasn't changed. As recently as 2020, as Jo points out in her book, 40% of Londoners have minority ethnic backgrounds, but 56% of full-time Birkbeck students, 42% of part-time students, between 40 and 50% of lower-level staff, though just 10% of senior staff were of minority ethnic background. But 10% of senior staff is still probably better than most other universities. And since at least the First World War to the present, the college has also welcomed and supported refugees. So Joanna brings to life the culture of Birkbeck over time, the culture it consciously created for students, including access to sports, music, theatre, to broaden their horizons, and also explores the staff culture, which always attracted and welcomed radical intellectuals like Eric Hobsbawm and the crystallographer J.D. Bernal, people who were often unwelcome in other universities, and who themselves were glad of the opportunity to meet and teach working class students at Birkbeck. Though not all the staff were on the left, and there were tensions, for example, with right-wingers such as the philosopher Roger Scruton. And Birkbeck was innovative in other ways. Among other things, it was early to teach economics, helping working people to understand how their deprivations came about and how they might change. And it established the first university department of computing in 1963. The man and woman who led it, who later married, built the first manageable small computer, influencing all our lives, though they had to move to Canada to gain professorships. Birkbeck was remarkable, but not perfect. And Birkbeck's had its ups and downs as funding has come and gone, but Joanna vividly conveys how it became and remains a distinctive, wide-ranging, innovative institution, responding to and seeking to influence cultural and political change. Throughout its history, helping to shape working class culture, among other contributions. And the book's most unusual among university histories in being enjoyably readable, partly because Birkbeck's history is more interesting, more diverse, unusual and fascinating compared with other universities, and also because Joanna conveys it in all its complex detail, as she conveys all of her work with such vivid, readable, convincing clarity. And so I hope that conveys something, a fraction of her work. Thank you.
So I was delighted to be asked to do this. I was given gender, medicine, and animals. And then I thought, oof, 10 minutes. So what I've done instead is give you 3 key words, which I think kind of enable me to extrapolate some of Joanna's contributions to scholarship. My first word is path-breaking. So much of what we take for granted in historical practice now, we owe to the pioneering work of historians like Joanna. I'm old enough to remember a time when the term gender history was used interchangeably with women's history, as if they were the same thing. Joanna was one of the first historians to challenge this, applying gender and feminist theory to thinking about men and masculinities too. As Pat has already said, her second book on working class cultures had a subtitle. It was Gender, Class and Ethnicity, and this signposted a much more nuanced and intersectional approach to thinking about the past. In this book, gender was a category of analysis in which femininities were in dialogue with masculinities. She made clear that these were unstable categories, and ethnicity and class were a factor inextricable from both. And these things generally hadn't been included in analyses of working class culture before, despite a growing body of work on women's lives. Within 6 years, setting the pace, which I think increased actually, Joanna had published 2 more groundbreaking books, Dismembering the Male and An Intimate History of Killing, that were completely transformative. Both books insisted that we examine how masculinities were made and remade in the context of war and afterwards. She showed us how the state owned and sought to mould men's bodies. She explored how masculinities were understood and experienced by men and by those around them. She brought disability into focus as a vital component of how we think about gender and society. Her work on masculinities demanded that we critically consider the place of boys and men within feminism. These works also reflected on women and femininity. So, for example, how did women on the home front think about killing? And this seems obvious to us now that we would do this, but if you look back at those books when they were published and the reception of them, you can see that reviewers were surprised that this wasn't something they expected. It was novel and important. This was a bold new way of doing history that was more what we might call inclusive. Joanna's work spearheaded masculinities as a field of study and taught many of us how to do gender history. But these works were path-breaking in other ways too. In her analysis of masculinities, Joanna made explicit the politics of heteronormativity. So while queer histories were gaining traction in the 1990s, heterosexuality was often just taken for granted in studies of class, culture, and gender. That, as she pointed out, it simply wasn't subject to scrutiny. Masculinity studies, such as they were, tended to focus on how bodies, economics, sport, and patriotism constituted normative masculinity. And Joanna insisted that we had to consider scrutinising heterosexuality too, and the manifold ways in which this helped constitute, police, and understand masculinities, both by the state, by experts, and by citizens. Joanna's early works also staked a claim for the importance of historicising emotion, and that was, as Pat says, the full spectrum of emotion: fear, boredom, guilt, pleasure, and hate. Crucially, as she moved into writing about fear and anxiety in the 2000s, Joanna was one of the first historians to insist that we identify how emotions were embodied, how the physiology of emotions were part of how, historically, social actors came into being. Secondly, she staked a claim for understanding emotion as an expression of power relations and insisted that we make visible how feelings are learned and disciplined. And this was imperative, she argued, if the history of emotions was ever to have bite. I love that. Now, obviously, Joanna's works have bite, not least because they make explicit the socially constructed character of categories such as pain, to reflect how context and milieu shape not only our ideas of pain, but our ability to relate to the suffering of others too. As she pointed out, we cannot interrogate things like fear, pain, or trauma without thinking about how environment, power, and difference constitute those categories. I'd also point out in Pathbreaking her use of innovative and bold methodologies. And again, this is right there in the early work. Joanna used oral histories, memoirs, correspondence, diaries, and cultural resources, film, art, fiction, when this just wasn't orthodox at all. She used them alongside surveys, statistics, government, law, and medical reports. This was new. It enabled her to foreground experience and the everyday in her critiques of the institutions and frameworks that shape citizens' lives, whether she was thinking about demob soldiers as disabled citizens or women in childbirth. She's also been one of the very few modern historians of modern Britain to pay attention to the presence and importance of religion and spiritual beliefs. If you track Joanna's scholarship across her career, her willingness to push herself out of her comfort zone, chronologically, more recently geographically, methodologically, is clear. She has a reflexivity too in terms of the language she uses, adapting language to be as inclusive and equitable in her practice as possible. And this, I think, brings into focus her compassion, particularly for minoritized groups, a compassion that has consistently guided her treatment of even the most gruesome of topics. Which brings me to my second keyword, provocative. And this is a word used so often in relation to Joanna's work. So some of the adjectives I came across while preparing for this were controversial, gory, gruesome, depressing, disturbing, unsettling. And yet we like her so much. So this is typically because Joanna is unafraid to address taboo. She forces us to acknowledge, for instance, that while for sure there was dying and camaraderie, War is actually about killing. War intends to mutilate men's bodies. She asked, how did people cope with killing? Did they take pleasure in it? What did passivity and boredom on the front do to people? And again, this upset an awful lot of people, as Richard has already indicated. This was a different approach to thinking, both about gender but also about war. By Joanna's own admission, her body of work deals with difficult topics. Recently, she addressed bestiality and zoophilia in her book, Loving Animals, a topic described by some as the last taboo and too dangerous for some dangerous ideas. Rereading my notes from reading my first reading of Loving Animals, I'd written that it was bold, it was imaginative, it was wide-ranging, thoughtful, inevitably provocative. I found some of the book incredibly hard to read because it does address head-on vicious animal cruelty and abuse, alongside the violence of misogyny and racism. If you read it, the Linda Lusardi chapter in particular, it just made me weep. This is difficult stuff. But Joanna's willingness to examine the things we sort of know but don't really want to acknowledge is imperative. Loving Animals, as just one example, asks ethical questions about our responsibility to animals. It advances an incisive critique of legal, medical, and political frameworks that shape our understanding of cross-species agency and affect. Joanna doesn't do provocative for the sake of it. She poses serious questions about power, status, and inequality, human and post-human. Which brings me to my final word, hope. Now, given the character of Joanna's oeuvre, perhaps this is not an obvious one to reach for, but I think it's vital that we acknowledge the presence of hope in Joanna's work. If histories that make us flinch are going to avoid being gratuitous, they have to contain the seeds of change. And Joanna's scholarship consistently situates historical actors within their specific context to expose the nexus of power relations that shape social interaction, that create particular environments and enable certain behaviours. Much of her work, I suspect, has been motivated by anger at injustices. But she shows us again and again how we arrived where we are. And crucially, she points to where and how we might go next. With pain, for instance, Joanna showed how the specificities of difference, class, race, gender, sexuality, culture, ethnicity, shaped how one's suffering was perceived and treated by the medical profession. By making these things visible, as she pointed out, we can address inequalities, not least when there is a dearth of medical education on something as fundamental as pain. One review of Joanna's early work on masculinity noted that she often veered towards the sociological. This was unusual, they thought, for a historian, but they weren't complaining. This was important if history was going to be meaningful. I would agree. From asking, do soldiers take pleasure in killing, to can we have a consensual cross-species sexuality, Joanna's work poses questions that trouble us. She demands that we think these through, but she guides us with compassion, insight, and an acute sensitivity to the importance of our differences. There's usually some biting wit in there too. She scopes how we might change the world around us, and she gives us hope that things don't have to be this way.
Thank you. We're here all today, of course, to admire and acknowledge Joanna's major contributions to the field, but also a personal debt. And I will also speak of my personal debt of gratitude. I know Joanna closely through the work we did. I had brought her into our advisory board for the New Psychology of War project, and asked of her things that one really should never ask of another person. What about this conference? Shouldn't we organize this? Oh, shouldn't we turn this conference into a special issue or into a book? Several years later, it has been a monstrous enterprise, but we did it, and thank you for your generosity. Her generosity as a colleague is, of course, reflected in her generosity as a scholar. She has 15 books, and still counting, and they vary in length from 564 pages in An Intimate History of Killing, 565 pages in Rape, Sex, Violence, and History, 500 pages in Fear, A Cultural History, and a mere 293 pages in Disgrace, Global Reflections on Sexual Violence. Her relentless capacity for work and production leaves me in awe, but I do know one of her secrets. Actually, I first met Joanna when we were at a conference. She was giving a keynote, I think, in Bristol. I can't remember the topic, but I remember this. We were having dinner at a pub, and at 11 o'clock she said, now I go back to my room and do the page proofs. And I said, Joanna, it's 11 o'clock at night. And she said, yes, but if I finish the page proofs tonight, I can buy myself a pair of shoes tomorrow. And if I don't, I can't. We've spoken of the shoes already. But we know her work has often focused on the dark side of human existence: burial, fear, forensics, killing, pain, rape, rapists, suffering. And as Richard mentioned, I'll focus my comments on violence and sexual violence, where we have overlapping interests. Her focus has been to ensure we understand the complex and contradictory range of human emotions and experience, also in relation to violence and sexual violence. So, as J.M. was saying, instead of focusing on war as an act where men become killed in war, it is the act of killing. Human beings, mostly men, becoming agents of death. That is her core question. And she focuses on questions of gratification, pleasure, in these acts of destruction. It would be easier for people, historians, psychologists, societies, to focus instead on perhaps trauma and suffering. They are easier to assimilate into our notion of the human, but instead she insists on focusing on what it means to see human beings as enjoying mass destruction, killing, and mutilation. In her view, we are obligated as scholars to see what are the dominant range of narratives that exist in a particular period and how people choose amongst those narratives. So she asks, how do killers become killers? How do rapists become rapists? And though she doesn't acknowledge Simone de Beauvoir, it does, for those of us who love Beauvoir, remind us of Beauvoir's question, how does a woman become a woman? And J.M. was talking about this as a contribution to masculinity studies. While sexual violence takes place both within war and outside of it, it's clear there are deep connections in war, especially in the context of civilian conflict among civilians. There is a lower threshold for committing sexual violence, and it is also exceptionally brutal because it is typically committed as a form of gang rape. And she, in her work, talks about what role language has in this phenomenon, reporting from an American Marine during the Vietnam War who spoke of an incident of mass rape and killings of women. She foregrounds his terms. He said, the men raped the girls, and then the last man to make love to her shot her in the head. And this word lovemaking, as she notes, is an example of how we can assimilate atrocities to everydayness. Lovemaking, you make love to your girlfriend, you make love to your wife, you make love and then you shoot her in the head. So this focuses on how language, concepts, and dominant narratives frame interpretations of violent acts, both by perpetrators, by institutions, and laws. They frame it in terms of authorized transgression, and she notes, and that's why rape is always essentially a contested category, infused with political meaning. Body parts and practices become sexual, either authorized or transgressive, through classification and regulation. As I read her work, she has two axes of analysis. that reappear in the body of her work. She's always focusing on the process of becoming and the work of concepts. I've mentioned that already. And that takes place on this axis, the relation between material cultural conditions and the role of self-creation. And on the other hand, also the axis of power and of resistance. She zooms in to the details of letters, diaries, reports, and zooms out to the big picture of ideological and political forces at work. One must, of course, account for the objective conditions, but one must also account for how they are subjectively lived in bodies and emotions. So she is crisscrossing between these pivot points. To tell only the story of the material and cultural conditions would overlook this human act of self-creation. To only tell a story of self-creation would overlook the role of cultural, material, economic factors. And that temptation to overlook it is something she repeatedly notes is an achievement of neoliberal ideology, where all impact of social injustice and inequality is projected into the private domain. So she ties together these different historical pillars by asking how particular material, cultural, and ideological conditions give rise to the dominant narratives from which people choose in their acts of self-creation. But they're never only dominant narratives. Where there is power, she notes, there is always resistance. We see this in the history of how marital rape exemptions for husbands was overturned over a period of centuries. We can think back to John Stuart Mill and think towards the final abolition of this exemption in the 1990s, both in the US and in the UK. But importantly, she notes, even with major legal advances, there are ambiguous effects, leaving in some cases, if divorce is more available and a woman is in court protesting abuse by her husband, then we can think, well, why didn't she just leave the bastard? I think that's important to remember, the ambiguous effects. I want to conclude by talking about her vision of the future for the human. In the final sentence of her book, 2007 book on rape, she writes, "By revealing the specificities of the past, we can imagine a future in which sexual violence has been placed outside the threshold of the human." What does this vision entail when we know, and she has shown, that the infliction of cruel and brutal violence, both sexual and non-sexual, is part of human history? Recall also Margaret Atwood's claim regarding The Handmaid's Tale. Nothing she refers to had not already taken place in human history. Joanna's call for imagining and forging rape-free worlds implies that globally and locally, we must seek alliances for organizing against systematic injustices fueled by, in her words, sexism, racism, colonialism, economic injustice, heteronormativity, transphobia, militarism, climate denial, and neoliberal capitalisms. In order to create conditions that can impact legislation, affect myths, and dominant narratives. Since we as individuals always choose from dominant narratives in our imaginative self-creation, effective activism would enable more people to see sexual violence as a disgrace to the rapist, to the law enforcement officer who refuses to believe people who report abuse, to powerful people who take advantage of their authorities to inflict sexual harms, a disgrace to justice systems, both in civil society and military contexts, that fail rape survivors, but never, never a disgrace to victims and survivors. Imagining such a world implies that we have to resist hierarchies, the hierarchies of the human, and doing that means we have to resist power, because power always installs hierarchies. And that means this vision of a future where sexual violence is outside the threshold of the human means making resistance to unjust power a central part of this future imaginary. Such a future also means acknowledging that humans always exist in a moral universe, also as rapists and killers, and enable more pathways for more people and more men to become harbingers of an anti-rape culture. Finally, as I noted, her work also shows that even progressive changes that take centuries to accomplish in remaking the world, in changing legislation, for example, the marital rape exemption, can have ambiguous effects. This needs to be a reminder for us that a future in which sexual violence is outside the threshold of the human is also a future that requires ongoing work against injustice, ongoing contestations over how to create this new imaginary. It is a future, like the past, that is a story of a process of becoming human.
Breather while we're doing a change of set, and then we're going to come back and there's going to be a conversation between Julia Late and Joanna, and then some other things. So just breathe out for 5 minutes. I think you could have 5 minutes fresh air if you want to. It's quite hot. we can say that. But it's also been really exciting, even for me, who knows Joanna quite well, to visit areas of her work that I wasn't as aware of. And Richard said at the beginning that she hadn't gone to school. And I thought, this seems to be quite a good idea then. Because her virtuosity and her lateral thinking is extraordinary. And I also was thinking about Angela Davis, somebody I've interviewed many times, who's also been part of the WOW journey over years, and thinking about this idea of hope and dreaming, and her proposal particularly around post-industrial prison complex and how people kind of go, that's impossible. And of course, it won't be impossible. And a post-rape world sounds, again, something which people say, oh, human nature. But actually, human nature is something we've decided to put into certain kinds of boxes and understand in certain kinds of ways. So I think this ingredient of hope is very, very critical, one of the words that you used. We did something together because Louise Hyde, another great academic and miserabilist, invited Joanna and I to lunch with Sarah Weir to kind of hatch a plot. And we hatched the plot that the Shame Festival that Joanna had led with this fantastic grant from Wellcome, it has to be said, that we would turn it into a festival called Shameless, which we did. First edition in London, the second edition in Brazil recently. And that was the opportunity to use that word shameless and to allow people involved in the field, including people who have had any version of a lived experience, which is many, to take that word and own it as a way of moving forward. And so, there is really such a strong overlap, finally, between academic research and the possibility for a human to exit from one space into another narrative. And that's a proposal that Joanna is constantly giving us. That festival, Shameless, produced thousands of other possibilities of research. So, you do really feel as if you're working alongside an archaeologist as well. And since, she lives just opposite the Acropolis, just a good thing, probably. But, she's constantly really dusting off with a tiny brush and going, well, have we looked at this bit? And have we looked at this bit? And it really does make for a very exhilarating and exciting relationship. So she's now going to be in conversation with Julia Late, who also, I think, has a similar vivacity and energy around her work. It's always good when you can read out titles like, Common Prostitutes and Ordinary Citizens. Prostitution in London, 1885 to 1960. So, honing in on that, which is everything from sex trafficking to courtesan, it's all kinds of things, and really unlocking words and rethinking them. Again, it needs energy to tackle those sorts of subjects. So when I use the word miserabilist, what I mean is somebody who's, again, thinking, okay, it's easy to close the waters over this stuff, it's comfortable, but it's nothing like the thing that we should be doing. We love scientific endeavour. We're always looking at new ways of thinking about the planet. People are so frightened of looking at new ways of the human being, but neither of these two are. Notches, her blog on remarks on the history of sexuality. I mean, a great blog as title. And then, of course, her acclaimed book, The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey, which won the CWA Gold Dagger for Nonfiction and the Best Roth Award for Labour History. So they're going to have a vigorous conversation. I'm not sure about what, but look, they're drawing in breath, and off they go. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So, obviously, I said a very enthusiastic yes when I was asked to interview you, Joanna, and I'm really looking forward to getting to ask you some burning questions that I've always wanted to ask you. But not
I'm
not
paying
too
for this now, if I can see. I thought it was too good. That first hour was just, oh, no.
I promise I'll be kind. So to prepare for this interview, I decided I was going to go to my secret room in Cambridge University Library, which I'm not going to tell any of you about, because it's secret, and if everybody finds out, then. And I was surrounded by your work, and it was wonderful. I stacked it all up, and I read it from beginning to most recent. And so I thought I'd get started by asking, you know, your PhD thesis on women in the 19th and 20th century, and your first book on women, economic change, and housework in Ireland, which feels a very, you know, long time ago in terms of, you know, both in terms of intellectually and also actually temporally. And I just wondered, what drew you to that first topic? And obviously you've left it behind to a certain extent, but what have you taken from it?
Well, I was joking to someone earlier that in preparation, I just came back from New Zealand, my dad's 90th birthday, so I had yesterday to prepare for today, and I was just telling someone that, oh my goodness, I'd forgotten what I'd written. So I went yesterday and I tried to look myself at my books, and that's the one book I don't seem to have a copy. Well, I know I have a copy of it, but it's in Greece. Okay, but I do know how I came to write that book, because, I mean, this is where I kind of discovered that actually I enjoy the writing process. And it came out of my undergraduate MA and PhD, which, you know, remember, this is, my PhD was 1989, the book came out in 93, the first book came out in 93. And, you know, for those of you who are too young to know, you know, at that stage, you know, women's history, and it was women's history, it wasn't gender history, was in its early days. And I remember, I was actually going to graduate in literature. That was what I was good at, actually. But I fell in love with, I was going to say the woman, no, I fell in love with the class that this woman taught, which was the first women's history course in New Zealand. And that kind of literally changed my life, because it was it was a history of people. Well, they weren't like me, but I kind of thought they were, because women were absent in everything else I was reading. And I was deeply influenced in those early days by socialist feminism. We've already heard of Angela Davis. She was my God star up there. You know, people like her, people like Firestone, people like lots of them. Oh, goodness. But these, and what they were doing is, at least a group of them, was wages for housework. And I should tell you that my first book was called Husbandry to Housewifery. It was a history of women in agricultural and rural Ireland in the 19th century. Wages for housework, that whole movement which I got involved with, which doesn't exist now, but taught me two things that were really important. The first was the role of domesticity in the oppression of women. But the second was the domestic sphere as a site of rebellion. And that is what sort of grabbed me. So I was interested in Irish history for my PhD, so it was a natural thing for me to say, hey, hang on here. Irish history had no women's history at that stage. It was really, and it still is to some degree, it's changing. It was very much political history and a great hostility to women's history. So I wanted not just to put Irish women back into history, where of course they always were there, but also to actually show that rural women had a role to play. It wasn't only your urban elites, it was your poor, I call it my chicks and cow book. It was women in the dairy industry and the poultry industry. I like chicks and cows. I've always liked chicks and cows. But you know, so that was how I got into it. And I think, I mean, now, I mean, I haven't reread the book because I don't know where my copy is. It was very much economic history, it was econometric history, it was social history of that old-fashioned variety. It's not the kind of history I do now. I was actually speaking to someone who I won't look at earlier today, who couldn't believe that I couldn't do sums. But it was very much economic history and econometric history. But that, and I took from that a sense of, you know, if I'm to do anything as a writer and as an historian, it has to be a political project as well as a academic or intellectual project.
Well, that certainly has been the theme that runs through all of your work, as we've heard.
Did it sound like I remembered the book?
It did. It really did. It really did. And it very similar to what I took from it, actually. I have a PhD student doing a Wages for Housework project right now. We'll talk about it.
I want to talk to her.
So, you know, as we've heard, you know, fear, rape, pain, dismemberment, you seem to have an abiding interest in very dark and difficult topics. But not just that, you seem to be really interested in the blurry lines, you know, in the unstable, in the uncertain, you know, in the contingent, the blurry, the fluid, the subversive, the transgressive. You don't want to work anywhere but in a shade of gray. And it's one of the things I love the most about your work and I find the most inspirational. And I just like to hear you ruminate a little bit on why you work in these shades of gray. What draws you to these blurry areas, these difficult topics, these dark topics?
So shades of grey, you're not talking about the porn that I'm not...
I am not.
Okay.
I am not.
Soft porn, okay, that's good. No, shades of grey, yeah, I think, how do I respond to that? Look, a poem. You know, if people ask me, I just mentioned a minute ago that actually my desired degree was actually in literature. And to this day, I think one of the great influences on my life is poetry, feminist poetry generally, but have to be girls. And I think the greatest influence in my early days, but to this day, which is why I often quote this poem, is Adrienne Rich. And I get so much from her. I did in the past and I do today. And she has a wonderful poem about those ambiguities and those blurred lines. It goes something, let's get it right, Joanna. It goes something like this. The body's pain and the pain on the street are not the same thing. But we can learn by the edges that blur. Oh, you who love clear edges, watch the edges that blur. And I think that for me, I mean, that poem summarizes what I want to be able to do, what I strive to do in my own work, because I am present in my own work. But those edges that blur between the individual, the me, the individual in history, and the pain on the street. And you know, in my own sort of historical practice, this tension and awareness of ensuring that I watch where they blur, you know, so that is important. But actually, I think on another level, and it goes back to something that was mentioned earlier, and thank you for all those so generous things people said about me. Okay, but I do think it comes back to not being educated. It comes back to my childhood as well, that those ambiguities. You know, I grew up in Zambia, Chicken-Carter, Solomon Islands, but Haiti. Haiti is the formative experience in my personal life, but also my intellectual life. You know, my parents are medical missionaries. Somewhere very early in my life, I misplaced God. I don't know where he got to, but I'm rather clumsy, so I think I probably put him away somewhere. But you know, those experiences of seeing exceptional poverty, exceptional violence. As a young child, you know, I was so familiar with machete wounds, with neck lacing, when you put a tie around someone and set it alight. Kwashiorkor, you know, and the violence was so much an ordinary part of my life, as ordinary as knowing the different varieties of pawpaw and which kind of lime suited which kind better. I mean, that was so ordinary. And I think this is a really formative thing, and the contrast between that and then, of course, traveling through the States to get money for the hospitals. My father built hospitals. He was a very good doctor. To get money, and the sort of meaningless consumerism, the country music and Christian tunes on the radio, and then arriving in New Zealand to the comfortable, placid, absolutely dull Matamata, you know, New Zealand village. I like Matamata now, anyway. You know, but those contrasts. So even as a child, there was this blurring and a confusion, and even as a child, those were the questions I was asking. And I think I'm really fortunate that in my later life, I got the opportunity to go to university, I faked it so badly. I faked it so well.
Clearly.
But, you know, I got that opportunity to then use this formative experiences of my youth to think more seriously. Whether people agree with me or not is a different issue, but actually to think through some of those blurrings, some of those ambiguities, some of those violences, you know, the way someone who loves animals can then rape them. It's someone who I've read their love letters, and then I find out that that same day they committed an atrocity. I mean, to try and grapple with those sorts of things.
It's funny that you should mention that poem, because that was the point I started weeping reading your book in the Cambridge Library.
Which book do I quote it?
I think it's In Pain.
Oh.
And I wrote down this line that I absolutely love, and I think it's going to become a bit of a mantra for me as a historian, which you write, a painful world is still a world of meaning. And I think that is such a powerful thing to remind ourselves of, particularly when we're miserableists, actually. But, so you are a miserableist, I think we've established, and you're in good company.
Yep, I think I am.
Which obviously belies your personality, as anybody who's met you knows. Have you ever thought about writing a comedy? Have you ever thought about writing about joy or happiness? Or do you suspect that could be worse?
Okay. I have a confession here. I am quite a prolific writer. There is one time in my life I had writer's block, and I had to actually give back my advance. I was commissioned to write a history of love.
It was
I
worse,
had writer's block. I didn't do it. I had to give back my advance, and I was thinking about why. And I know the answer is in that I only write about things I know nothing about. Housewife, housework, dismembering men, Costas, get close sometimes, but not quite there, killing. I write about things I know nothing about. Love, nah, I couldn't do it. But, okay, more seriously, I actually have written an article on love. It's called Love and Limblessness. It is, honestly. Honestly, it's called Love and Limblessness, and part of it is about a wonderful society. A wonderful society that was established in 1915 in Britain, which was called, and I like all the thus, it's called The League for the Marrying of Broken Heroes. The League for the Marrying of Broken Heroes. And it was a league set up to matchmake between broken heroes from the First World War and, as they called them, plucky lasses. And it was wonderful because about love. I won't talk about the limblessness now, but about the love bit, because there are three things that really fascinated me. The first was in terms of love. You want to know about love?
I do.
I'm an expert. Love and limblessness. The first thing was I learned that men fall in love through their sight and women fall in love through hearing. And therefore you should marry a limbless man. The second thing I learned was that true love for women is about unselfishness. Yeah. The third, sorry, I'm just looking at my partner over there. The third thing I learned about love is eugenics. They were obsessed with the eugenics implication of men coming back from the First World War without limbs or with other disabilities. And that was that if you married a man with no legs, your child would not be legless. But the child would inherit moral characteristics such as courage, fortitude, patriotism. These are the three things I know about love.
That strikes me as very bad advice. And I was actually struck by the fact that you, through all of these difficult topics, you thank Costas all the time and saying, you know, without that support, you wouldn't be able to write about these difficult topics. And that I found that very moving. So you do know about love, I think. Not just limblessness, but also
Don't get me
love.
sentimental.
And the other thing you always mention in your acknowledgements is Birkbeck, your colleagues and your students. And I think that anybody who's read the Birkbeck book will get a sort of a glimmer of what Birkbeck's meant to you and how it's influenced you. But could you elaborate for those who haven't? what your time at Birkbeck has meant and how it's influenced your scholarship.
I owe a huge debt to all the institutions I've worked in, Auckland University, Australian National University. When I came to Birkbeck, I came from a fellowship at Cambridge. And Birkbeck was like a let out of jail free card. Sorry, Cambridge. No, seriously. Birkbeck, the colleagues and students were, they created my career. So firstly, my colleagues, of course we have disagreements and, you know, the usual stuff. But there was never a time, ever in my career at Birkbeck, where I felt I shouldn't write this, or I shouldn't do this. In other words, that support, that intellectual support, has never wavered. And that's part of our tradition at Birkbeck, and particularly in HCA. And I can see, you know, people here in this room who've headed our department and who've been absolutely central to ensuring that that is forefronted. But also it's students. You know, I'm a New Zealander. You now know I didn't get much education. But I was in Britain teaching modern British history, and in my class, I was young then. It all happens. And in my class, there were people who had lived through the periods that I was teaching them about. And I just learned incredibly so much. And I know academics always say that about their students, oh, I learned so much from my students, but I did learn so much from my students. And they always pushed back. They were always there to learn. I think Birkbeck students are unique in that sense that they are giving up a lot for their education. They're giving up their nights, they're giving up their weekends, and you know, they want to be there and they want to learn. And so that was always important. But also my PhD students. I've been incredibly blessed with, I think, over 30, 35, something like that, who've got through, who basically, you know, have pushed me in ways that sometimes I didn't necessarily want to go, but I had no choice. And that's always, I've always been really grateful to that. And many of them now, in fact, some here in this room, have amazing careers elsewhere in the world and have published their own books, and I continue to learn from them. But I think, you know, it is firstly about the nature of the institution, which, as you've heard earlier, I wrote the history of, hoping to debunk the myths, and I ended up becoming a true Birkbeckian in the context of that, but also the fact that our student body is so unique and passionately involved in what we're doing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And as somebody who'd made the same Cambridge to Birkbeck journey, I couldn't agree more. So, I've got a question that I can't wait to hear the answer for, which is, what's your favorite of your books? Everyone else can't wait either.
Okay, in all truth, this is not a good answer, but it's the truthful answer. I'm going to give you two, actually. But in all truth, I always like the last book the most because it's closer to me. And I do find that if I was going to write some of the other books again, I would write them very differently. So, you know, I have changed so much in the way I approach or the way I look at my world and the worlds of people around me, that's inevitable. So, in that sense, it is the Disgrace book, but there is a book that I really am quite proud of, and it's the book that no one reads. In fact, it's one of the books that no one has mentioned today. And I don't know why I'm proud of it, but I am. And that's what it means to be human. And I think the reason I like that book is because it really pushed me into very territory that I found very difficult. It's basically, it's a book on what it means to be human. So it's a book about how you, who is the true human, what is the human animal, non-human animal, human animal. So it's very much an animal book. And, where do people sort of pinch that Mobius strip of life and say, here's where the human starts and the animal finishes. But it also made me engage with Derrida and really think about my own positionality in the context of those debates which are so rife in history about similarity versus difference, about culture, nature, human, animal. So it pushed me in a more philosophical dimension that and maybe that's why people don't read it, because historians don't like it and philosophers don't like it, but I like it because it taught me a lot and made me really interrogate my political position within these debates in a way I hadn't before.
And who cares what philosophers and historians think anyways, right? But in some ways, that book is kind of asking the meta question that speaks to your whole body of scholarship, isn't it?
Which is why I would rewrite it. I think I would keep the introduction, conclusion, everything in between.
Yeah, I don't tend to reread anything because, yeah, exactly. It just gives you more work. Okay, now I've got a question that I know everyone else wants to hear the answer to, which is, what's next? What's your plan?
Well, there's a really lazy saying. I hate it when other people say it, but I'm going to say it. I've got so many books inside me. So many books inside me, but it's true. I'm actually writing a book. I'm writing a book which is called Evil Women. It's about female rapists and murderers. So we're talking really evil women. And it's got two parts to it. I've done a lot of the research for it, but I haven't done the proper thinking for it yet because I'm doing that over the summer, so I can buy another pair of shoes. But it's got two parts to it. One part is about people who commit really horrendous crimes. But the other part of it, and how does that change over time? How are they seen over time, and how do they change over time, and how are they perceived over time, etc. So the basic, what historians do. But the other part of it, is interrogating that notion of evil. So how does evil change between the 1830s to the present? The concept of evil, and evil women as well. And it does change dramatically over the period. And what does that tell us about the difference between committing a terrible, evil act and being an evil person, and how that changes through time. Why is it that someone like Myra Hindley, for example, is just vilified? You almost never see her name without evil attached to it. Yet Ian Brady has disappeared. Well, he's dead now, but he did disappear early before he died. The evil label is attached to her, whereas people who did identical crimes committed don't have that thing. So that's part of it. But I also have other books. That's just one of the books. That's the one I only work on one book at a time. And in fact, any writers here, only work on one book at a time is my advice to everyone. But I'm also writing a book on body parts.
Which ones?
Oh, well, they're actually based on the lectures I gave here at Gresham College, which I owe Gresham College a huge amount for supporting what might have been considered a little bit, to the not center of what you do, but I really appreciate Gresham supporting. So for the Gresham lectures, I went from hair to eyes to breasts to stomach to penises and clitorises. You can get it on YouTube. To feet. The book will look at more body parts than that, but basically I went down the body. And I'm also got, and that's in planned form, but I'm not writing it until I finish Evil Women. And then the third book from that is going to be on the paranormal, and links between the paranormal, the Communist Party of Britain, Great Britain, Cold War politics. And I wrote an article on that a few years ago, but I've collected material for that book. But don't hold your breath, there'll be 5 years, 6 years. And then I'll retire.
Only 5 or 6 years. This is the amount of writing you do is just absolutely incredible. And so I kind of finished. Well, I finished with Disgrace when I was in my wonderful secret room in the library. But I spent a lot of time with the Birkbeck book as a Birkbeckian myself. And in it, you write, by creating free-thinking, independent, and culturally aware citizens of the globe, Birkbeck provides a basis for exploring the irreducible plurality of the human condition. And I think you are talking about Birkbeck, but I think you're also very much, I mean, you might not realize it, but you're talking about yourself. Because I really think that irreducible plurality is at the heart of everything that you do. And it's absolutely central to the beauty of your writing, and it's the meaning that everybody finds in it, even though these topics are so difficult. And so I think we're running out of time. And so I'm just going to say thank you, Joanna. Here's to irreducible plurality. And
yes!
Thank you for your tireless and beautiful work at the edges of our humanity. And I'm sure I speak for everybody in the room, the thousands of readers and students who you've touched, and everybody who's going to find your work later, that we cannot wait to see what comes next. Thank you.
Okay, I've got on my way. Okay, so we're letting Joanna off the hook again now, so that she can sit back and enjoy some more plaudits. It's interesting you were talking about literature, and I was just thinking about actually Samuel Beckett, and how people who don't know Samuel Beckett's work just think it's, about misery. And of course it is, but it's also about endurance, and something that comes beyond that moment, when the extraordinary nature of humans is that they're prepared to carry on enduring in order to find out what living is, to the very, very last speck of the moment of extinction, and maybe even after that, who knows. But that idea of somehow finding something that is not dystopian in amongst all this carnage is, again, something I think profound about what Joanna's doing, because it's very cool to be dystopian, and it's not very cool to be an enthusiast. Obviously, you're redeemed if you're working with really difficult material, but even so, I think the journey that Joanna's on is to not end up in the New Zealand, Foursquare village, but to try to make sense and change what might have been happening in Haiti and in many other parts of the world, and not take any of those things for granted. And that's utopian, which is a political position, which we haven't talked much about, but I think it's a really critical part as well of her journey. Joanna's had a huge influence on all of us. I mean, you wouldn't all be here. Obviously isn't just wandering off the streets. So you must have connective tissue to what Joanna's been doing in her life and her work. But I talked at the beginning about the ability to help others flower. And so we're going to watch a film now of students of hers who've made a film. It's a surprise film. You can take it away with you, and you can show it to yourself over and over again. So let's see this film.